Hello and welcome to Dialogue. A recent ruling by Panama's Supreme Court has thrown the future of two major ports at the Panama Canal into uncertainty. The court ruled that the contract operated by a Hong Kong-based firm is unconstitutional, calling into question nearly 30 years of port operations. The decision could have far-reaching implications for foreign investors, Panama's business environment, and confidence in long-term contracts at one of the world's most important trade chokepoints. What exactly did the court decide? Why now, after 30 years, was this judgment made? And does this case signal a broader shift in how strategic infrastructure is being politicized by Washington in pursuing a new version of the Monroe Doctrine? Join us for discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, joining me today to analyze the multi-layered signals behind this turmoil, Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, Benjamin Norton, founder and editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report, and Edward Lehman, managing director of Lehman, Lee and Xu. Welcome to the show. So, Edward, I will start with you. Obviously, this is presented as a legal case, the ruling by the Supreme Court in Panama. What do you make of this court ruling after nearly 30 years of operation by C.K. Hutchison, the Hong Kong company?
Yeah, I think we first have to talk about what it was exactly. A concession agreement is essentially a long-term agreement where a government, in this case Panama, allows a private company to operate, invest in, or manage a public asset such as a port, an airport, a highway, or a power plant, while the state retains the ultimate ownership. In this case, Panama granted, under a Supreme Court rule in 1997, rule number 5, Panama Ports Company, which is controlled 90% by C.K. Hutchison Holdings, the right to operate the Balboa and the Cristobal ports at the entrances of the Panama Canal. But what the Supreme Court did rule in this case, but it did not say, is it did not accuse the company, which is really unusual, of any sort of wrongdoing. I'm saying C.K. Hutchison Holdings, or PPC. Instead, the court in Panama said that the state itself had failed to follow constitutional proceedings when granting and renewing the concession, particularly by avoiding tax exemptions, exclusivity, and insufficient environmental review. So in the state's own process, essentially, they're saying it wasn't the operator's conduct, but they've made this decision, and that's why it's so disruptive and kind of unusual from a lawyer's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, as we know, since 1997, the Canadian subsidiary of the Hong Kong company, C.K. Hutchison, has invested over 15 billion Hong Kong dollars, paying over more than 5.2 billion in taxes and creating thousands of jobs. And most importantly, they helped transform the two docks into world-class logistic hubs. And now with this court ruling, somehow, obviously, they will lose the business, according to the ruling. Why now? Why, in a sense, so sudden about being ruled unconstitutional?
Well, this is exactly the point. Why now? It's a very good question. This contract was renewed in 2021, and we're talking about 5 years later at least. The court all of a sudden found that this is unconstitutional. I think this court is nothing more than a kangaroo court, to be honest. This whole thing is a political issue. This whole matter follows after the trip by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio in February last year. It's widely reported he warned the Panama administration about Chinese companies' presence in Panama, and now the Panama government has come up with this kind of a half-cooked legal solution to this. It's framed as a legal solution, but as I said, this is all a political matter, and I think it violates everything pertaining to the contract law. It violates everything pertaining to the government's legal commitment to a foreign entity. So I think this thing is going to be challenged in arbitration courts as the C.K. Hutchison has already filed I think at the end of the day, it will seek justice. This is totally unjustified, illegitimate coercion. It's nothing more than a blatant nationalization effort, in my view.
Well, Panama insists this ruling reflects an independent judicial process grounded in its constitution. And of course, it comes against the backdrop of much explicit U.S. rhetoric about the Panama Canal. Ben, if you look at that, U.S. President Donald Trump has repeatedly claimed China is, quote, operating or running the Panama Canal, and said, the U.S. is going to, quote, take it back. And more recently, I think like a couple of days ago, there's a presidential message, about the 250th anniversary of the country. He basically said that, I stopped foreign power from taking over the Panama Canal. So how big is the U.S. influence, about the decision in another country?
Yeah, this is the most important factor here. It's very clear that this is a politically motivated decision. Anyone who's followed Latin American politics in recent years knows that there is a long history of politicized court rulings. This is known as lawfare or legal warfare. We saw, for instance, political judges in Brazil imprison Lula da Silva, the current president now. And then also there was a very political ruling against Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, the former president of Argentina. This is very common for the region, these political rulings. And it's very important to understand the larger geopolitical context here. The U.S. government has been very explicit about the fact that it is trying to force all of the countries in Latin America to cut off all of their ties with China. And the U.S. government has been openly invoking the Monroe Doctrine, a 200-year-old policy. And really, it's a very colonial mentality we see in Washington. And Marco Rubio, who's Trump's Secretary of State, has also been especially interventionist in the region. In the first trip he took abroad as Secretary of State, he went to Central America. He forced Panama to withdraw from the Belt and Road Initiative. And then the U.S. government forced Panama to create new telecommunications infrastructure, cutting out Huawei, and instead replacing Huawei infrastructure with infrastructure made by U.S. companies. And then we also saw that the U.S. pressured Panama to make sure there are no Chinese representatives on the Panama Canal Advisory Board. There previously had been one, there no longer is. And if you listen to the rhetoric of the U.S. ambassador in Panama, he has constantly said publicly, we are trying to make sure that China has no influence here in this country. So they're essentially treating Panama as a colony. They're violating the sovereignty of this country and telling Panama it cannot have its own independent foreign policy. And this is why President Mulino is, in fact, very unpopular at the moment, very low approval rating. And there have been large protests in Panama, not necessarily because of the issue involving him cutting relations with China, but more generally, people in Panama are angry because they see their leader as acting on behalf of a foreign power, acting on behalf of the United States. President Mulino in Panama is very closely allied with Donald Trump. So this is a clear attack on the sovereignty of the region. And this whole idea of the Monroe Doctrine, which they now call the Don Roe Doctrine, is essentially an attempt to violate the sovereignty of the region and treat it as the U.S. so-called backyard. It's not the U.S. backyard. It should be an independent region.
Well, Edward, to what extent is the U.S. using Panama as a test case, to push Chinese influence out of the Western Hemisphere? They, often talked about the sphere of influence and also the Don Roe Doctrine.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, 5% of all the world's goods apparently go through the Panama Canal. 40% of all American goods go through the Panama Canal. So that's kind of a choke point for things that are really important to the world and to the United States, certainly. Before that was built, obviously, you had to go down below, Argentina or the Cape Horn to be able to get to San Francisco or to get to the other side of the world or the country. And so it's made a big difference since it was created. The Monroe Doctrine was implemented, but obviously was not successful. I mean, Cuba has been sort of a glaring example of foreign influence in the Western Hemisphere. but to follow up on it, I mean, certainly the Greenland situation and the discussion about that has been one that is trying to influence, to keep all Western powers out or even European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. So, I mean, I don't disagree with anything that's been said before, certainly, and it's obviously going into overdrive right now for whatever reason. It's a geopolitical reason. The world was completely different back in 1997. This all took place, and now I think that the Supreme Court is, and I don't disagree. I mean, I was going to the region since the 1970s. I mean, Central America, that's the term banana republic comes from that area.
Yeah.
And, long been said an extension of the United States. So, I mean, we're not saying anything that hasn't been said like a lot of times before. I mean, one of their presidents before Noriega was captured and brought to trial in the United States. So in the Panama Papers, I mean, there's a whole flurry of stuff where there's been embarrassments coming out of this country time and time again. And, it's an interesting place, and it's a, firebrand for what's happening in the region. But I do see that they're going to have some issues in the international arbitration trying to maintain what they're doing, frankly, if it's done fairly.
So John, I mean, of course, that there's a clear. I mean, there's a few people would disagree with the. It's very clear the U.S. is trying to basically somehow, bring the whole region under their influence or under their control. But will they succeed? I mean, if you look at the recent decision, the latest decision, of course, it was made in the court under the spirit of the rule of law, but with the consequence to erode the international law, obviously, right? Or the international order, which is not the case anymore. But will the U.S. succeed in terms of their, let's say, endeavor to drive the Chinese commercial interests in this region?
Well, I think in the short run, it's showing signs of very success. But in the long run, I'm not sure it's going to be successful. I think in the short run, if you look at a series of actions taken by the United States government, for example, the bombing these fishing boats in the Caribbean, the kidnapping of the president of a foreign country, which the United States calls a law enforcement action, and I can fully understand maybe the Panamanians' perspective that they are freaking out. I guess. I mean, looking at what happened to President Maduro, what happened to these fishing boats in the Caribbean, and God knows what the United States is going to do to Cuba. I can fully understand they're freaking out. They're really scared. But I think in terms of the military power, I venture to say that the United States can do whatever it wants in the Western Hemisphere. No country, from a military perspective, can even stand up to that great power. But I think over the long run, I'm not sure it's going to really help with the United States' interests. America has a long history of interfering in Latin America. I mean, look at how many dozens of coups, regime changes, the CIA and other, U.S. federal governments have orchestrated in Latin America, and it has left a very, very bad reputation. One of them, I guess, mentioned, going to Panama one time and taking out the president of a sovereign country. These actions, testify that the fact that the United States is a hegemon, and it's a unchallenged hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. So I think, you asked this question whether it can be successful in the short run. I think in terms of military actions, it has been shown it's been quite successful. But I think at the end of the day, it has to, reckon with the long-term prospect, and also reckon with the prospect of China is probably going to push back at some point. I mean, we have extensive economic interests in the Western Hemisphere, and I think we're not going to be pushed around like this anymore. Seeing American governments going to other countries and basically trying to kick out Chinese interests. At some point, there's going to be some reckoning. There's going to be some actions pushing back. I think Washington better be really thinking about these things before taking these bold actions further down this very precarious path down the road.
Yeah, so speak of that, of course, there's a strong Chinese presence, biggest trading partner for many countries in Latin America. For example, the Shanghai port recently opened, of course. It's said to be designed to become the primary logistic hub for South America-Asia trade and provides a direct Pacific route that bypasses Panama Canal, slashing the transit time to China by 10 days. So Ben, does this somehow diminishing probably strategic importance of Panama Canal affect the Chinese decision, to fight back harder or somehow, okay, let it be? And then, of course, we will touch upon, what are the means and tools the Chinese side could resort to protect its interests.
Well, I wouldn't diminish the importance of the Panama Canal. The port of Chancay in Peru is very important, but this is a port on the Pacific coast, and it's largely going to be used to transport goods to South America, whereas the Panama Canal is more for access to the Gulf of Mexico and to Central America. And the infrastructure in South America, for instance, the infrastructure is not very well developed. There have been discussions of creating, in fact, a railroad going from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic coast through Peru and Brazil. In fact, China has been involved in the discussions for creating that railroad. So the port of Chancay is a first step, a very important first step to creating more of that infrastructure. But for now, in the upcoming decades, the Panama Canal is still going to remain very important, which is why this issue is of such significance. And to understand what's happening, I think we really need to look at the national security strategy that was published by the Trump administration. They openly invoke the Monroe Doctrine, and they spelled out very clearly what their strategy is. They say they want to take control of all of the strategic infrastructure in the region, and they want to kick out what they call non-hemispheric competitors, which is a clear reference to China. So again, Washington is telling the countries of Latin America that it will not allow them to have an independent foreign policy, which is a violation of their sovereignty. So we've seen the U.S. invaded Venezuela and kidnapped its internationally recognized president in January. That was directly modeled after the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989. That was cited as a precedent. And now the Trump administration is trying to economically suffocate Cuba by threatening to impose tariffs and sanctions on any country that sells oil to Cuba. And there are reports of mass shortages of fuel and rationing going on, and people may soon start dying because there's no access to oil, which is needed for modern society, and electricity in hospitals and such. So what we see is a very aggressive policy by the U.S. I agree that this, in the medium to the long term, could backfire because, of course, people in Latin America are tired of this interventionism and imperialism. However, in the short term, this is very devastating for many countries in the region. And unfortunately, Panama is part of this larger pattern that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Well, Panama itself, Edward, will suffer, of course. The Chinese side already is reportedly calling off or calling, a pause of the Chinese investment or infrastructure construction in that country. And also, Panama flagged ships probably will also received with tighter scrutiny probably. So what are the Chinese response economically, politically, diplomatically to protect its interests?
Yeah, I think it has a whole host of cards that they can play. Obviously, diplomatically, like you said. With regards to the country itself and investment itself that is being or has been promised to be put into Panama or would continue to stay on in Panama. That's one card to play. Certainly, with regards to the International Chamber of Commerce, which is the arbitration body that's slated to make this arbitration. I think that China, needs to learn some lessons about what happened in Philippines with regards to, it's a completely different body, but I think that there's some lessons to be learned to get in front of that as opposed to getting behind it. And with regards to, having some input and some strategy and some plan. I know they're doing it, but it's sometimes they're playing catch up with those types of things for whatever reason. And I think they need to get in front of that. The with regards to the ship flagging, I mean, the reason why ships are flagged to Panama is for their tax exempt status and because of their the wages and the laws. So if a ship is flagged, and it basically takes on the laws of the ship of the nation that they're flagging it from. I mean, Panama is a non-taxable jurisdiction, and it's one of the biggest places that they have flagged ships. But so even U.S. ships and whatnot are flagged from there. But there's plenty of other locations. Liberia, I think, is number one. I mean, Western Samoa is number two. These are ships that are there for flags of convenience. But China can make some kind of a framework in which it's coming down on those ships that that are dealing with Panama in some way, shape, or form. So I think that there's a whole host of things that they can do, but they've got to sort of get it coordinated in an effort and not necessarily just play yell victim. Yes, they are a victim. There's no question about that. But it's something to just get on with it and try to get in front of some of these problems in a proactive way, because I don't think anyone wants to listen to, hey, we're just victims. Yes, China is a victim, but yes, China can do and has a whole bunch of alternatives on what they can do in order to fire back. And I think that they should and they will.
Well, John, I mean, of course, C.K. Hutchison has already filed a case for international arbitration. Personally, I don't have high hope for that. Even for the International Criminal Court, their prosecutor was sanctioned by the U.S. The U.S. can always say, no, whatever, the result, I just don't follow. I don't give a damn about your final ruling. So, what are some of the possible choices for Beijing? You have to protect your interests, in this region. Remember, we have a growing presence there, but most of the commercial presence. We don't have basically a military basis like the U.S. has surrounding China. So, when the U.S. talk about security consideration, it's not about security. It's basically a competition problem from Washington. Seeing in growing Chinese presence, they're not happy with that.
Yeah, well, Chinto, let me first answer your question by adding a little bit of footnote to this, the importance of the Panama port. Panama port is totally different from Chankay port, as Ben said, that it serves the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. I think most of the cargoes are going to American ports, as a matter of fact, going to Baltimore, going to Charleston, Savannah, these very large ports on American's eastern coast. So, making the situation, worse in Panama is actually not in Americans' interest. Now, having said that, about the recourse that the company, C.K. Hutchison, has resorted to, this is essentially a commercial arbitration, in my view. I mean, it's a little bit different from, the Philippine case, which is about territorial dispute. This is a arbitration which is usually specified in the contract, in agreement signed, I guess, back in 2021 between C.K. Hutchison and the Panama government or the relevant authority in that matter. In the contract and agreement, there should be a couple of clauses pertaining to, in the case of dispute, there's an arbitration route and which arbitration authority is going to be going to, that kind of thing. And I think overall, it's fairly a fair process in my view. I don't know which place are they seeking arbitration in. I think if it's in Singapore, in Hong Kong, these are, having demonstrated a track record of being delivering quite fair arbitration deliveries. So I think this is actually a quite powerful weapon. But I think in addition to this, the Chinese government and also the Hong Kong SAR government also are engaging in actions essentially to target the Panama government. I mean, this is essentially a government action, right? It's a rip-off action by the state. It's a rip-off action. It's a nationalization action. It entirely nullify a signed legal contract internationally, and come up with essentially an excuse delivered by a kangaroo court. I think the Chinese government has already said that it's actually withholding investments by Chinese companies in Panama and there might be more severe consequences going down the road. So I think both sides, the private company as well as the government, need to coordinate with each other to take some actions so that the Panama government can understand that there is a cost by violating the international law, by walking away from a legal contract, by illegally nationalizing assets held by a legitimate foreign investor. And I think there will be consequences, and there will be lessons for future prospective foreign investors in the state of Panama.
But for the legal recourse, John, I mean, if the ruling of the international arbitration is in the interest of H.K. Hutchison and against the Panama government, what will happen?
Well, it will deliver essentially a ruling saying you need to do this. And I think probably the ruling might be in the form of having C.K. Hutchinson getting compensated for something. I mean, the arbitration ruling is essentially an arbitration ruling, right? Yeah. What it says is that in the contract, both sides signing that contract agree with the ruling potentially delivered by an arbitration court. So if the Panama government throw away that arbitration ruling, that means that it's entirely throwing away international law. And I think for future investors, foreign investors, we have to be very careful. Everybody has to be very careful,
right?
With what has going to happen with this government. It can just throw away these rules and laws anytime, anywhere they want.
That's right.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Just to pipe on the arbitration, so it's not going to reverse the court ruling. I mean, the court ruling is ridiculous. I mean, let's just say it's saying essentially it should never have allowed this to happen. But there will be price consequences in the ruling. So it'll be the invested capital, it'll be the loss in future revenues. I mean, it's huge. Termination costs and declaratory judgments and findings on the brief. But it's not going to reinstate what this whole thing. Now, they may rethink it. I mean, in any time they can rethink this from a political standpoint. I mean, and I think that, and John is absolutely right. I mean, this is not similar to this is not an international, this is a commercial question, not an international question. I do think, though, that my point on bringing up the Philippines case is just that I think to get legal support for the arbitration, be prepared. And diplomatic signaling, economic signaling, these kind of things need to be lined up now, not to be on your back foot and not react, but then be proactive as far as what they want in order to win. And I think it's interesting because Panama, 30% of the population has its origins back to China. I mean, some number like that. So it's not insignificant that there's a connection to China for the Panamanian people. And so, I mean, it's not just, a sovereign country, but it's also some connection to China.
Right. Lastly, Ben, if you look at, there are some similar cases, like in Darwin Port in Australia, because of the U.S. pressure, Darwin Port has become, kind of like a flashpoint in the U.S. geopolitical struggle with China, placing Australia in the middle of severe diplomatic pressure, kind of similar to Panama. Your comment on that?
Yeah, well, I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the upcoming months and years in Panama, because I would be hesitant to call this a nationalization, because let's not forget that originally the idea was that these ports, the concession would actually be given to a consortium led by BlackRock, the massive U.S. investment firm. So we'll see. Obviously, C.K. Hutchinson, the Hong Kong firm, has said it's going to appeal this decision. But if in a few years we see that BlackRock ultimately is given the concession and control over these ports, it will be very clear without a doubt that this was a political decision.
Right.
And it was essentially the U.S. government pressuring Panama to make sure that a Hong Kong firm cannot own it, but a U.S. firm can.
On that, we are coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.